Today we are fortunate to have with us poet and essayist Michael Sowder, who is the Associate Professor of English at Utah State University. Sowder's first collection of poetry, The Empty Boat, won the T.S. Eliot Prize, was a finalist for the Utah Book Award, and was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. His second book of poetry, House Under the Moon, is just lately out from Truman State University Press. I recently came across something that perfectly describes my own encounter with Sowder's poetry. Wayne Booth, giving us 4 ways to approach literary criticism, stated, "Some authors offer us rich, imaginative moments of reconstruction. Some engage us primarily in active thought about the truth of things. Some emphasize practical questions and choices, and some, like Shakespeare, Dickens, and Homer, cover the whole range. Michael Sowder's poetry covers the whole range. His poems record imaginative reconstructions, complex thought processes, and practical questions in seductive landscapes that seem to pray through the trickle of water and the caw of crows. Something special comes from hearing poetry," Sowder said. "People become poets by listening to other poets. Lucky for us, today we get to hear the poetry of a man whose heart is dealt to the land. We get to listen to poems that evidence a heart finding its mate everywhere. May we listen and become poets ourselves." Please join me in welcoming Michael Sowder.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? It's okay, great. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for that prayer. Was that Megan who did the prayer? Thank you. So, okay. So I thought I was going to get here late this morning because our garage door opener broke. And so my truck was out in the driveway, so I was able to get out, but my wife, we had to call a friend and take our kids to school. And so I was driving down through the rain, and Jennifer called me, and one of our boys called her on the cell phone sick, and so she was walking through the rain, crying on her way to school, trying to get our son, and I was going, oh no, But anyway, I made it without an accident or anything. So, okay, so I'm going to read a few poems from both of my books, The Empty Boat and House Under the Moon. And I read here about 4 or 5 years ago, shortly after my book, The Empty Boat, came out. So it's really nice to be back here. Thank you to Steve, and thank you to BYU University for having me here. So I thought I would, well, I think I'll just start with I'm going to read some family poems and some spiritual poems. And but I thought I would start with sort of a Halloween poem. It's not really, but it's from my first book. I wrote a lot about crows in my first book. I was really fascinated with crows for many years. They're actually very smart animals, and they're actually very beautiful if you spend time paying attention to them. So it's not really a Halloween poem, but it is a crow poem. It's called At the Rehabilitation Center. Let's see if I need to explain anything. Did you guys know that a group of crows, like a flock of crows, is called a murder? A murder of crows? That's a pretty cool word to know, isn't it? Okay. At the Rehabilitation Center, we called him Ahab, the crow with the missing foot, who lived with his cellmate in hog wire between snowy owls and turkey vultures. On early mornings when fog lay over the marsh, my love and I gathered stars of cat food spilled outside the cage and held them up to the wire. Because crows are familial, their murders are families. Parents make 2- and 3-year-olds stay home to help raise the younger simps, breaking up early courtships. So being familial, Ahab leapt up to the big white limb in the cage and took the hardtack out of our hands. He'd leap back down to the floor, wings unfurled, and stride on foot and stump to his dish where he dropped the snack in the water. Then he waited, one eye cocked toward the softening red star, dipped his beak, threw back his head, and swallowed with a shuddering of wings. We did this again and again. Sometimes the birds were fed cereal, and one day alphabet cereal, and that day we put words in his mouth: bug, fish, nevermore. Before long, he knew us by sight, and we came welcomed by whistles, clucks, and caws we were beginning to understand. So I'm going to read a couple more poems from this first book, a couple kind of family-oriented poems. This is a poem that I wrote after I had moved away from home and went back home to visit my parents. They had retired and bought a house in the mountains of North Carolina, and they lived up in the mountains. And it's called Learning Names. All my life I heard him call her mother. Dad, can we camp out in the backyard? Ask mother. Or, Mother, can you pick up the shirts at the cleaners? Now retired, they've left the city, moved to a house overlooking a valley in North Carolina. She tends tiny junipers, rain trees, elms. He nails and glues maple and birch for birdhouses, toys, and hand-carved signs. In town on Tuesday and Thursday, they teach farmers, mill workers to read and write, but they too are learning names. Evening grosbeak, honey locust, yellow trillium. In the quiet before dawn, I sit under a lamp by the window, a visitor now. I hear them stirring in the next room, talking in low voices. Outside the window, slate-colored juncos are chirping and flitting in rhododendron leaves, and I hear him softly say, Kathleen, the way he must have said it 30 years ago. So I think I'll read a poem that I wrote for my wife. This is called Falling Asleep for Jennifer. You're sleeping when I hear them, hoofsteps knocking loose rock, scraping the ground, mountain goats coming into camp, floating in moonlight on delicate ankles, a ragtag band of angels. I hear teeth tearing tundra in the dark. The old couple on the trail said they found the lost boy, frostbitten but alive. Deer, he said, lay down beside him all night in the flying snow. The last coals break and fall in muffled exhalations, the goats gone down the meadow, coyote yipping on the pass where a Milky Way arcs out of sight. I nestle in my bag to the sound of your breathing, rising and falling like the mountains around us. I float into sleep at 10,000 feet, the night giving wings to our bones. So I'll read one from my new book, which is called House Under the Moon. And I really like how they did the cover. I found a painting on the internet, and the press that did this book, they designed the cover, but I thought they did a really good job. I wanted to write, they're partly kind of fatherhood poems and then partly spiritual kind of meditation poems. And I was writing two collections, one of each, and then my wife Jennifer said, why don't you combine those two? And so I think it was a good idea because I think the family fatherhood poems kind of ground the spiritual poems, and the spiritual poems kind of give some aspiration, to the family poems. And so anyway, I wanted something, a title that represented both of those. So I called it House Under the Moon to kind of represent both parts of it. And I found this painting on the internet, and it was a Canadian artist named Chelsea Barg, and so I contacted her to see if we could use the painting on the cover of the book, and she said, oh yeah, sure. She said, if you just give me a few copies. And I said, okay, great. So then after a while, I thought, I should really buy the painting if it's going to be on my book. So I emailed her and said, hey, I'd really like to buy your painting, And she said, okay, that'd be great. She says, well, it's listed on the internet for $50. And I was going, $50? I was thinking it'd be like $500 or $5,000 or something like that. She said, well, it's quite small, And so I bought it, and it's like about this big. So it's on my wall, but it's like really tiny. It's bigger than this. This is the whole painting, and then they did kind of a blow up from it up here. So it's the moon and kind of some cliffs. But anyway, so I have the painting on my wall. It's really small. Anyway, let's see. So this is called Aiden Looks at the Moon. After the bugling of elk, dinner by the wood stove, we turned in, slept till midnight, and then you woke crying, inconsolable. I carried you out of the cabin, across the porch, where September poured over us with fragrance of sage, and you were hushed. In the moon lacquered dark, aspens quaked with owls, and I looked at you, awake in my arms, 5 months old, eyes like pearls, staring at the moon, that lantern lighting this field and continent. Your first time to look at the famous orb that lit the plains of Troy, the face implored by Sappho and Sydney that Li Po leapt for, drunk and drowning, crone of Whitman, Hecate to Plath, O Ariel, O huntress, light this boy's nights when he hikes these mountains or comes home late from cards or loving, illuminate his honeymoon and housewarming, and when he grows past all my wanderings, soften his sleepless nights as you have mine, when I walk the house in the dark and find you in a window, reminding me again that beyond whatever carapace of longing or fear I've wrapped around myself, something calls to me from a home where the elk steps in the river. So now I'm going to read a poem that, let's see, that's a little complicated, I guess. It's a poem for my second son, Kellen. And so I guess have you guys been studying some creative writing, some literature? So anybody know the two parts of a metaphor? Anybody know the two parts of a metaphor? Like my love is like a red, red rose. My love is called what? Anybody know? My love is one thing and then the rose is another. So the thing that you're actually talking about is called the tenor of the metaphor, and then the thing you're using to describe it is called the vehicle. The vehicle. So it's like it carries the meaning in a new way. So my love is like a red rose. My love is the tenor, the rose is the vehicle. Actually, if you go to Greece, you can see delivery trucks with the word metaphor written on the side because it means like vehicle or transport, you know? So that's pretty fun. But anyway, so this one has those words in it. And so this one I wrote for Kellen, my first son, his first April when he was almost 1 year old. He wasn't quite 1 year old, called Kellen, first April. Steady in the new grass, feet spread wide like a lifter's, you stand by your red dragon blanket, head thrown back and laughing. In your right hand you have a wand as your left reaches for Cirrus. I'm on my back reading Wilbur's Praise in Summer, and metaphors tumble out. You're Bernstein conducting finches in a blue spruce, the child Adam praising another day, Jawurtamakai conjuring buzzard and coyote, Brahma reborn, fingers spinning starry pinwheels, the baby Ajax lifting the pillars of heaven. But then the poet asks, why this mad instead? Can I not see you as you are at all? 11 months old, sure-footed, second son, transfixed by sunlight, the mystery of balance, a finch-fringed tree. Power resides in the shooting of the gulf, said Emerson, and like the goddess of secret and ancient coincidences that Rilke named rhyme, perhaps our leaping passes all our kenning. Maybe you're not the tenor of my imaginings at all, but the vehicle, having leapt from your mother's body, half-fledged of me, restringing lovers' genes and eyeing a future we will never see. And now you shake your stick and yell at the sky, while across the April grass 1,000 suns light up your feet. So that poem by Richard Wilbur, which I referenced in there, is a really fun poem. He says, you know, when I feel called to praise the things of the world, I start saying this and this and this, and then I realize that, well, I'm not calling things what they really are. I'm turning everything into a metaphor. And why can't we just appreciate things as they are? Why do we always have to call them something else and turn them into a metaphor? That would be much better. Let's start doing that. And then he says, let's just start praising these things like this. And then he gives 3 examples, and gradually he moves back into metaphor, you know? And so it's like we can't stop making metaphors. We love metaphors. So let's see. Okay, so now I'm going to read a few spiritual poems, and so I should just tell you about my spiritual life just a little bit. I was raised Roman Catholic and had 11 years of Catholic education with priests and nuns and that whole bit. And then when I got to college, I got really interested in yoga and meditation, and I got really interested in Eastern philosophy and Eastern religions, and then I kind of left my Catholic background and got really into Eastern stuff. But then, I'd been meditating some years and reading lots of books about meditation and Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. And then I found this little book on my parents' shelves by Thomas Merton called In Seeds of Contemplation. And I started reading, and it was by this Catholic monk who lived in a monastery in Kentucky. He's actually very famous. And I started reading his book, and I realized that, a lot of what he was saying and the way he was talking sounded a lot like these people from the East, And so then I discovered that that there's a kind of contemplative, meditative tradition in Christianity too, which I didn't even really know about. So I started really studying Christian mystics, and so I was practicing meditation, and I was reading Christian mystics and reading all these Asian texts and everything. And then I decided I was going to be a yogic monk, and I was going to go to India and become a yogic monk. And when you do that, you renounce family, and you become a penniless, begging person. You become the idea is you see the whole world as your family, and you serve everyone equally, and you love all people equally. This is kind of the idea. And but in this order I was involved in, it was very strict, and you never saw your family again, And so I started really having doubts. It's like, I don't think I can really leave my mom, forever. And so I didn't do that, and I entered a kind of spiritual crisis. And then I kind of made my way to Buddhism, and I was really interested in Zen. And so I became kind of an agnostic and got really into Buddhism and practiced Buddhism for, I don't know, about maybe 15 years or so. And I loved it. There was a lot of things I loved about it, but I really missed the kind of devotional aspect of religion that Buddhism doesn't really have. Buddhism doesn't have the idea of a personal deity, a personal God. It's just kind of like, it's much more based on just the here and now, which is good, but I missed this devotional aspect, and so I've kind of made my way back to where I started in a lot of ways. So anyway, this first poem is the first poem in this book, The House Under the Moon, and it's about Saint Teresa of Avila. She's one of these mystics that I love. She's was a nun in a convent in the 17th century Spain, in the town of Avila. I got to go there a couple years ago, and it was really fantastic. And, these people dedicate their lives to prayer and serving others, and that's what they do. Anyway, so here, it's called Lectio Divina. Lectio Divina is a practice of monks and contemplative people of doing spiritual reading, which, I'm sure you all do too. Lectio Divina. With my mother's pitted paring knife, I sliced the yellow, uncut pages. La vida de Santa Teresa de Jesus. No tears, then her voice. Is it just the old story of wander and homecoming that triggers this in-breath, Euryclea touching Odysseus's scar? When I was young, her words were gold leaf, plucked strings, feathery. I trembled at muero porque no muero. I die because I do not die in him. I turn pages and her steel flashes. Descanso? Rest? I need no rest. What I need is crosses. Or is it the way I've found my own dawn cries lifted, sung by a woman an Atlantic away, centuries ago, in a convent of barefoot nuns, a town of stone and light, in a book I've called from a warehouse, acids hurrying it to dust, pages never cut open until now. O Santa Teresa, may your words that I am breathing in this slow disappearing light my way to Avila. So I'm going to read a couple kind of spiritual poems from my first book. One of them was referred to in the introduction. Thank you for that. It's called That Drink. And Okay, that drink. So this is a fun poem, I think. I'm also very inspired by the Sufi poets. You know, the Sufis are, as part of their spiritual practice is the Sufi dancing you may have heard of. They're sometimes called the whirling dervishes in old literature, and they have this beautiful devotional poetry. As a matter of fact, the best-selling poet in America is Rumi, who is a 14th century Persian Sufi poet. And his books sell better than anybody else's in this country, so it's really amazing. But anyway, the Sufis are great. They're like a really wonderful sect of Islam because they very much embrace all religions. You know, they have ceremonies where they light a candle for all the world's religions, and so, you know, in a lot of ways, I think, you know, they could really like save fundamentalism. You know, fundamentalist Islam. But they're also persecuted by the fundamentalists too. Their shrines in Pakistan are often blown up and stuff like that. But the Sufis are wonderful. But anyway, so this kind of inspired by the Sufi poetry. And the funny thing about it is that, you know, the Sufis are ascetics. You know the word ascetic? They practice a lot of self-denial, so they don't drink alcohol or party or any of that. You know, they're ascetics. But in the poetry, they talk a lot about getting drunk and drinking, and they use the idea of intoxication as a way to talk about spiritual ecstasy, you know. So they experience the divine and they have this ecstatic experience and they say, well, it must be like getting drunk, you know, even though they've never been drunk. Anyway, so this kind of picks up on that tradition. It's called That Drink. More and more things kindle inside, incandesce. More and more edges soften, thin, until all the transoms open and you see how things are sunk and set in light. Then the heart finds its mate everywhere. There are streams where we are going. When the water bottle goes in the water, it always comes out full. I tell you, pretty soon, that which is inside and that which is outside are going to have that drink they penciled in 1,000,000 years ago. So I have that line about penciling something in, you know, which is going to be anachronistic really soon. Nobody will know what it means, right? Because we're all on our iPhones putting in appointments, you know. Used to mean I'll pencil you in. That means I'll make a tentative note in my calendar, but we may still change it, you know. So anyway, that's kind of an older phrase. Let's see. Oh yeah, and then now there's a tradition in Zen poetry, Zen Buddhist poems. There's kind of a tradition of irreverence, and the idea is that not to take it all too seriously. You know, matter of fact, there's this fun Zen saying, which is kind of a joke, but has a little bit of wisdom under it, which is if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. You know, and the idea, it's a funny little saying, but it's cool because supposedly the Buddha's last words were, be a light unto yourself. Be a light unto yourself. And so there's this idea that you know, you don't want to do everything the Buddha did, you know, because you got to find your own way, sort of. So anyway, there's this tradition of irreverence where like something's a little bit irreverent, but underneath it is this deeper reverence. And so this poem is kind of in that tradition. And so it's called The Lost Verse, and it's about when my first son was born, we got him an aquarium. And, you know, if you've ever had an aquarium, if you get one, you got to get one of these little fish that eats all the algae. Otherwise, the whole thing will turn green and scuzzy, you know. And so it's called a plecostomus fish. And so when you buy a aquarium, it's like, well, what am I going to put in it? You can have little castles and little Barbie houses or whatever. And so like I had a little extra Buddha statue, so I put the Buddha down in there, you know. And so I was looking at it one day and I thought, oh, I think there's a poem there, you know. So I wrote this poem called The Lost Verse. It's got a little bit irreverence, but there's like a deeper reverence underneath, supposed to be. Anyway, The Lost Verse. In your birthday present aquarium, Hypostomus Plecostomus rests in the lap of the Buddha, his body divided bow and stern, half black, half pale tangerine, like a yin-yang cigar or a half-lit submarine. An algae eater, all morning he's been sucking the scum from the Buddha's body, cleaning that great roundness, hands and face, chest and thighs, while Gautama sits quietly, 2 feet under, without breathing. All about them shimmer the spangled host, neon tetras, silver angels, prayer flag gouramis, rainbows, firemouths, pearlfish, a water filter, their only choir. And all the while, there at the center, Mr. Plecostomus lies content, knowing how the lost verse said, "Blessed is the scum of the earth, for it shall adorn the body of God." So it's kind of a joke at the end. The Buddha's not really considered to be God or anything in Buddhism, but I kind of took a little liberties there. So anyway, okay. So then I'll read a few more poems from my new book, and then we'll have time for some questions, okay? So should I finish like about quarter till? Okay, great, all right. So I read that poem, Aiden Looks at the Moon, about being in a cabin in the Tetons and him waking us up in the middle of the night and me taking him outside and seeing the owl and all. And anyway, it turns out in looking over this book, I have quite a few poems about like what happens when your son wakes you up in the middle of the night. You know? Then I go out and do this, and I go out and do that, and here's a poem, there's a poem, all based on being woken up in the middle of the night by your son. I might even read two of those. This is called Kellen in My Lap, 5 months old. In a circle of lamplight, I read again Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. You play my fingers like piano keys, arranging and rearranging them, finding new patterns, melodies. When you woke in the 3 o'clock dark, we moved out here to a room where you could play and I could work. What is Satori? Suzuki asks. The bottom of a pail broken through. Coyote, mountain lion stalk the hills above our house. Darkness holds its wing above the valley. Orion brightens January snow, and down in the far fields flickers a single yellow window pane. The delight you find in my fingers, a monk has no words to name. Let's see, okay. This one is called In the Face of It. When my second son, Kellen, was born, he had that thing where like his lungs weren't fully developed, and so he had to be in the NICU, for about 11 days. And they had to like put this surfactant in his lungs. It's kind of this fluid. It's one of the last things to develop when you're in the womb. And so anyway, he woke me up one night in the bed, and he was laughing. He was just like laughing in his sleep. And I thought, well, that's funny, And so you guys know what Mount Moriah is? Mount Moriah? Yeah, good. That's where Abraham took Isaac up to sacrifice him, okay? So there's a reference to that in here. In the face of it, after midnight you wake me again, second son, not yet one, laughing in your sleep. Abraham named his second Isaac for one who laughs. Your name's Gaelic for warrior. They took you up Mount Moriah the day you were born, Intermountain NICU, bound and abraded you for days with IVs, feeding tubes, ventilators, injections, white coats hurrying about with their terrible ministrations. Tonight, I think you're dreaming of the lowing in the cedars and the flash of a knife vanishing in the sky. So, let's see. Here's a poem called Morning Song. Morning Song. Summer nights we pulled fireflies from the dark, our hands becoming lanterns. A child's trick, sure, but on that morning when trees on the highest ridge catch fire and behind the mountains inside you, the Holy One rises like sun on bronze, you'll lie back in the grass among the drowsing fireflies as the falcon in the word of the poem takes off, and you close your eyes to the cry of one name echoing through canyons, creeks, and clouds. So I think I'll just read a couple more, and then we can finish up. So in the Baptist tradition, in a lot of Protestant Christian traditions, there's this idea of being born again. This idea that you have to be touched by grace and born again in order to be saved. And, Jesus said that you have to die in order to be reborn. And so this is something that I wrestle with in several poems, that when you have some kind of profound spiritual experience, it's kind of like part of you is gone, part of you dies, and part of you is born again. And that's the way they would say it in that tradition. But so anyway, I have a couple poems about that. Let's see if I can find this one. So in the Sufi tradition, this is kind of a comparative religion reading, In the Sufi tradition, God is always referred to as the beloved, the beloved. And so this is kind of about having a spiritual experience and thinking of the divine as a kind of beloved. Okay, my beloved's eyes. When you first came to me and I looked into your eyes, I died as Moses warned and did not die. I wept. As the sun pulls the apple blossom inside out, your eyes drew me. I became Whitman's spider, Kabir's dolphin, Augustine's circle. The fact that your eyes are dark with the dust of galaxies wholly undoes me, and I see that undoing is what we long for and turn away from in anyone's eyes. As on that Sunday morning, walking the streets of Atlanta, looking for Garcia Lorca, I caught the blues of an Army vet with a Colt 45 standing on the fire escape steps. So I'll just read two more. This one is called Yesterday I Saw. Oh, wait, I'll read one before that. There's also a tradition in a lot of spiritual poetry, a lot of spiritual writing about, sometimes you feel like your life is full of grace, It's like you're walking around and everything is beautiful and you feel so happy and everything seems wonderful. And then you have times where you feel like you're very far away from the spirit and you feel, it's often called the dark night of the soul by the Spanish mystics. St. John of the Cross, who was actually kind of a protege of St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross invented that phrase. You've probably heard it, the dark night of the soul. So St. John of the Cross, also 17th century Spanish mystic. He wrote a poem and then a book called The Dark Night of the Soul. So anyway, this is kind of a poem about the dark night of the soul. When you leave my house in the night without a word, and I don't know if you are ever coming back, can't you understand what that's like? You say I'm dramatic, but remember Herzog's Nosferatu and the ghost ship that slides up the canal of that Dutch village, breaking the branches of the sycamores as it comes to a stop? Who can say how it got there? There's no one on board, no one at the helm, just a coffin and 1,000 starving rats bringing the Black Death to another sleepy town. My house is that town. So these are all kind of prayers, really. This one is called Yesterday I Saw Your Heart Open. Yesterday I saw your heart open, like Mary's, crowned in my child's picture book of saints. And inside glittered constellations, galaxies, an ocean I saw I could enter in my little boat. Now I've been floating in this place for 1,000 years, playing on my flute the songs you taught me in another life. I've lost my coordinates, my map, my route, my ticket, my name, my number, all my cares blown out with a whisper like candles at the meadowlark's song. So I'll just read one more poem, and then we can have time for questions or comments or suggestions for revision or anything like that. I'm an inveterate reviser, you know. I can't read a page of my poetry without wanting to make changes, and so it's funny. There's this funny story about the painter Bonnard, who's a French painter, and after he finished his paintings and they were displayed in galleries or museums, he would like sneak into the gallery with a trench coat, and under his trench coat he had brush and paints, you know, and he would go up there and try and keep revising his paintings. That's the way I am with my poems. You know, I revise them and revise them and revise them and revise them, and then finally I send them out and they get published in a magazine, and it's like, okay, I'm done with that. And then I look at it again, I think, oh, that's really bad, you know, and then I want to revise it again, and then it comes out in a book, and I change it again, and yada, yada, yada. And then if something gets anthologized, you have one more chance to revise it. So anyway, this is called Ever Since. Ever since, I can't stop wondering if I died. I'd been nursing my favorite griefs, like a baby or a drunk his bottle, when you came strolling in sandals down White Swan Lane to lay your hand upon my forehead. I remember a brimming, then the flood. Tulips in crystal toppled over, walls and windows fell away. I felt my skin dissolving, pores, veins opening, a body become transparent, spaces between atoms visible. I could hear Mirabai calling. Then the world hushed like dawn on the Bay of Bengal. Everything vanished in the quicksilver of morning. Far distances rested my eyes. It was a lucky throw, a gold coin, a winning ticket, all grace and gladness, my ship come in with perfumed sails. And who was that singing at the helm? Friend, I'll tell you a secret. That gold coin's in your pocket, the tickets sewn in your sleeve. There's a ship at the wharf with your name on the hull and flying on the flag. Thank you all. Yes?
Well, I have two.
Okay, great.
Okay, one is, how often do you write poetry on
Okay, great. I got kind of a late start on family, so I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they get up at 6:30 every morning, and so I get up at 4:30 every morning, and I get up and I meditate and I write in my journal, and so that's when I usually do my writing, or at least the germination of my writing. So I write in my journal early in the morning. It's a wonderful time. Everything is quiet. The whole world is quiet, and so I write every day. And some things turn into poems, some things turn into essays, so it just depends. So, yeah. And another question?
Yeah, and then, I guess how long do you usually work on a single poem?
Years, usually, yeah. In the beginning of The Empty Boat, there's a sonnet called Lightning Welk, and I worked on that for about 8 years. It's only 14 lines, you know. The famous Roman poet Horace, he said, when you're writing a poem, you should do a first draft and then stick it in a drawer for 11 years and then come back to it. So I'm not quite that bad, but I, you know, like I write a draft and then I work on it and revise it, and, you know, then you just kind of live with it. You think about it when you're hiking, think about it when you're driving, you know, go over and over the lines so you get the rhythm nicely done, and you think about images and metaphors and how well they're working, and so you kind of just live with your poems, you know. So like the whole beat thing, you know, the beatnik poets, they had this idea which was first thought, best thought, don't revise, you know. But that's really a bunch of nonsense, you know. They actually revised quite a bit themselves, and if you see their manuscripts that they worked with their editors, you know, that they revised a lot too. So, and the thing that this is kind of a Buddhist idea, first thought, best thought, because the idea is like this moment is where it is, you know. In Buddhism, there's the idea that the future is not here yet, right? And the past is gone. So all we ever have is this moment right now. And so they say, well, the thought you have in this moment, that's the thought. You don't want to change it, right? But when you sit down to revise a poem, that's a new moment too, and it's a first thought again, so you can keep having more first thoughts. And so, that's really, I think it's just kind of a pose they had. I just did that brilliant stuff, one afternoon, or whatever. Or Walt Whitman, oh, spontaneous me, Walt Whitman. And then Wordsworth, who defined poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion, recollected in tranquility. And so Wordsworth, again, revised, and Whitman revised the heck out of his poems. But he wanted to make it look like they were spontaneous, just this, spontaneous overflow of emotion. But he really revised a lot. I did my dissertation and scholarly book on Walt Whitman, and if you read his notebooks, you find all sorts of funny things in there. Like at one point he says to himself, "Never mention any other writer." So it's like he was just a voluminous reader, but he would never mention another writer in his poetry because he wanted it to sound like it was all, oh, spontaneous me, So anyway, so yeah. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that you had this kind of like spiritual journey that you went on, and you had considered going and becoming a monk maybe and so forth. At what point did you decide you wanted to be a poet? Was that something that just kind of came upon you, or was it a decision you made instant, or did it kind of find you rather than find you?
Yeah, great question. When I was in high school, I read Wordsworth's poem, "The World is Too Much With Us." I don't know if you guys know that poem, but the world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending. We lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. And I read that when I was in high school, and I thought, wow, this poem just says everything I've always believed, And so I kind of knew then I wanted to be a poet. And so when I got to college, to university, I totally fell in love with poetry and the Romantic poets, and I decided I wanted to be a poet. But then at the same time, I was getting really deep into meditation and yoga and everything. And so one of the biggest sacrifices I was going to make in becoming a monk was giving up poetry. And that was really heartbreaking for me. And also, I'd been a classical guitarist. I was going to give that up. And so lots of big sacrifices in doing something like that. I actually have a poem that I didn't read, which is called, I'm spacing on the title, but anyway, the last part of it is, says, a monk puts on a saffron robe and becomes a walking flame. And because when you decide to become like a yogic monk, you renounce everything of your personal life, and the last thing you do before you take your vows is anything that you have with you at the moment, you burn it all. So there's this big fire, and you put on the saffron robes, and you burn your old clothes, and you burn all your possessions, and so then you're like reborn, totally fresh, So poetry was something I was actually giving up, And then there's a whole part of my life I didn't talk about, and that is that after I went through this kind of spiritual crisis, the first thing I did is I decided to just go to law school, So I thought, I'll just go to law school, I'll just live in my head and make a bunch of money, and I'll forget about all this other stuff. But that didn't work. So I was a lawyer for about 10 years, and poetry was calling me back, and calling me. And so I always tell my students that poetry is a very dangerous thing. It can ruin a perfectly good career, So now I'm poor but happier, So other questions? Yes.
You mentioned all the time about the spirituality and things that are in your poems. Where does that inspiration really come from for your poetry? Does it come from while you're reading or pondering things, or do you come up with a topic first and then automatically, because of your background, you kind of work the spirituality in?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. Well, a lot of it comes from when I practice meditation in the morning. So when you practice a lot of meditation, it's like a practice of quieting the surface chatter of your mind. Because, it's weird about our minds. Like if you go to the gym and work out, you're working out, and then you're tired, you give your muscles a break, right? But it's like your mind, you can be thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking, and your mind is tired. You really want to break, but your mind never stops, So like in meditation, you try to calm the surface level of your chattering mind. And then the idea is, and which I've found to be true, is that then you get in touch with deeper parts of yourself, and insights come up and inspiration comes up. So I get a lot of inspiration during my morning meditations, and then I write immediately after that. And then in my journaling, there's a wonderful book called The Artist Way, which is by Julia Cameron, who is a former wife of, what's his name, Cameron, that did Avatar and did all these, James Cameron. Yes. I'm sorry? No, a book, Julia Cameron, who wrote The Artist Way. It's a book about stimulating your creativity. And the practice, one of the main practices she does is what she calls doing morning pages. And so that's like every morning you write 3 pages of whatever. And it doesn't matter what it is, if it's good, bad, junk, it doesn't, if you're just complaining about your life the whole time, that's totally fine. Because it's kind of like a process of getting the garbage out of your head. So you just write it all down. And then again, it's kind of like the meditation. After you work through all the surface chatter and the moaning and complaining that we all do about our lives, then some creative stuff starts coming. And so I don't know if that really answers your question or not. Sometimes like I have a spiritual feeling or spiritual experience, and then I try to, sometimes I actively look for metaphors, to kind of capture that. And then I read a lot of spiritual books and pay attention to, the stories there and the metaphors, and so, okay, thanks. Other questions? Comments? Yes?
So you mentioned that some of your writing turns into poetry and some turns into essay.
Uh-huh.
How do you decide?
Usually, well, Robert Frost said a poem begins with a lump in the throat, and so sometimes you just have an experience and you just know that there's a poem in it, I guess. And an essay for me has a little more narrative to it usually. So like I'm writing, I recently went down to northern New Mexico, and I was going to stay at a monastery down there, a Catholic monastery called Christ in the Desert Monastery. It's very cool. Anybody can go stay there. There are only like about 10 monks, but it's at the end of this canyon on the Chama River, and you take this dirt road for 22 miles up into this canyon, and then at the very end of the canyon there's a monastery, and you can go. You don't have to like participate in any of the activities. You can just go and hang out. And so I was going to go there. But anyway, and it's also right across the road from Ghost Ranch, where Georgia O'Keeffe lived and did a lot of her painting. So these two very cool places right there together. But there was a terrible snowstorm, and I couldn't get into the monastery, so I stayed at Ghost Ranch. And then I went back down to the town of Chimayo, and there was it turned out it was Good Friday, and there was this chapel there, the Santuario de Chimayo, where there's this holy dirt, you can go stand in line, and 30,000 people walk on pilgrimage to this tiny chapel on Good Friday every year, and they go into the chapel, and some of them are on crutches and in wheelchairs, and it's supposed to be this place where miracles happen. So it was Good Friday, so I went and participated in that whole thing, and then I met this Sikh who, the Sikhs are spiritual tradition from northwest India. There was a murder of the 6 Sikhs in Wisconsin a few weeks ago. People thought they were Taliban because the men wear turbans, but they're not even Islam, much less anything like that. But anyway, so I met a Sikh there, and he took me to their temple, and so it's like I had these 4 great places and great experiences, and so I felt like, well, I can't really get all that into a poem, and so I thought, well, I'm going to write an essay. So I'm working on an essay about this kind of experience I had. So partly it's because I kind of feel like the heart of poetry is the lyric, and the lyric is kind of like a moment, and whereas prose tends to be more about time, movement through time. Of course, there are lyric essays, and you can, complicate anything. But I guess for me, poems are like these moments, which is why I love poetry, because if you read a novel, you read hundreds of pages and then you come to this climax, and then the novel's over, right? And in poems, you just go right for the climax, and forego everything else. So I love poems for that reason. They're like this little self-contained experience, You don't have to read a lot to get it. So anyway, so yeah. I don't know. It's probably just feel sometimes, so yeah. Other questions? We probably have time for a couple more. Yes?
I'm just curious. It sounds like you have a lot of mentors, whether that be other poets,
A lot of what? Sorry?
mentors,
Metaphors?
mentors,
Mentors, yes.
like other poets and spiritual mentors. And I'm just curious, as you're reading and discovering what these other people said, how do you determine what's valuable to you and what you just kind of leave from what it is?
Let's see. I think it's mostly just I'm this sounds silly, but I'm a astrological Cancer, and cancers are very much supposedly cancers are very much they live through their feelings and emotions, which also is true of the Romantic movement, So, but anyway, so it's kind of intuitive for me, I guess I kind of feel like that when I read something and I feel a kind of resonance within me, then I want to follow it further, and so then I just follow it like that. Whereas if I read other things and I feel like, so I think it's just kind of intuitive for me. Yeah, so I don't know. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes?
So, who are some, I guess, poets that have really inspired you or influenced you? I know you kind of mentioned some, but
Yeah. Well, I went to grad school, a PhD program, knowing I was going to do my dissertation on Walt Whitman. So I fell in love with Whitman when I was an undergrad. So I love all the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, all the Romantics. And then I love the American Romantics, like Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. And then, I love so many. I love Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. Do you guys know about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes? Are we about out of time? Getting close. Okay. Bye. Anyway, Sylvia Plath is this great American poet who killed herself at age 32. She was an American poet who went to England and met this other young British poet named Ted Hughes, and they had this very intense, passionate relationship that became very tempestuous, and they were both these brilliant poets. I mean, I love Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. And then after 7 years, their marriage was really struggling a lot, and so then Ted Hughes had an affair. He left. Well, they got separated, and then he started seeing another woman. And so Sylvia Plath had their 2 children, and she moved back to London, and it was a very very difficult winter that winter. And so one morning she before the children woke up, she opened all their windows, even though it was winter, and she put a towel under the door, put milk and cookies up there, went downstairs and put her head in the oven and killed herself. And she had had several suicide attempts before that. But anyway, so Ted Hughes, they were still married, and he inherited all of her. He inherited her estate. And she was one of the first female poets to really talk about women's experience, talk about what's it like to be a mother, what's it like to give birth, things that weren't really in poetry before so much. And so the feminists just loved her. And so they hated Ted Hughes. They felt like, well, he's responsible for her death, obviously. And, in some ways there's something to it, because Ted Hughes, he then married this second woman, Asa Weevil, and she killed herself too, and their child. So it's like this terrible, tragic story. But anyway, so he had all of her papers and all of her poems, and he published her last book of poetry called Ariel, which is the book that really made her famous. And a lot of critics were saying, well, he probably, took out the bad poems about him, and he probably destroyed some of the journals that are missing and all this terrible stuff. And anyway, I'm obsessed with this story. Sorry to be going on and on, but anyway. And then, but he was poet laureate of Great Britain. And in Great Britain, you're poet laureate for life. It's not like here, it's like your whole life. So his whole life, 30 more years, he lived in the shadow of this suicide by Sylvia Plath. And so then he wrote and he would never talk about their marriage, never talk about their relationship. But every year on her birthday, he wrote a poem to her for the next 30 years. And then he published this book called Birthday Letters, and then he died. So it was like the last thing that he had to do. And these poems will just blow the top of your head off. First, Sylvia Plath's poems will blow the top of your head off. If there's anything left, Ted Hughes's will take care of that. But then I was teaching these two books to one of my grad classes a couple years ago, and on the way in, I heard on the news that Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes' son had hung himself in Alaska. So it's like Sylvia kills herself, his second wife kills herself and their baby, and then he lives the whole rest of his life. People, like, especially women, a lot of women and feminists hate him. And so, like, when she died, her legal name was Sylvia Plath Hughes. And so her headstone, it says Sylvia Plath Hughes. And so feminists break into the cemetery and they chisel off the word Hughes, or else they smash the whole headstone with a sledgehammer. So anyway, I love Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. They are just amazing. Their poetry is so powerful. It's just unbelievable. But anyway, I love them as a kind of nature poet. I love Gary Snyder, Mary Oliver, people like that. I really love Mark Doty a lot, Gregory Orr. So there's just a lot. Yeah. So it looks like we're almost out of time. Maybe time for one more question. Yes. That's interesting. No, it wasn't. I actually discovered his love of crows after I started writing mine. And so somebody told me, do you know his book Crow? It is a fantastic book, yeah. They were both brilliant poets. But yeah, Ted Hughes writes about crows too, especially in that book. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.